since starting in 2017 and has worked across other ABC teams, including the investigations units and on Radio National's background briefing program. Max was also a researcher on the ABC television documentary series Nemesis, and is the ABC journalist and co-chair of the ABC Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and representative on MEA's National Media Section. Please welcome Max.
Just thinking, don't want to get my mic technique wrong, that would be very embarrassing for a radio journalist. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you for having me. I thought I'd just introduce myself a little more, though I think you got the gist of it there. I've been working at the ABC for about 7 years now. My day-to-day job is at Radio National on the breakfast program as a producer. But as was referenced, I've sort of been lucky to rove around a few different parts of the ABC in recent years, including on background briefing, which is one of my favourite programs on the ABC. It's an investigative long-form radio program. And also as a researcher on Nemesis, on the recent ABC documentary, which I hope some of you saw. It was a really interesting thing to be a part of, and it did quite well for the ABC as well. So we were quite pleased with it. And I'm sure you'll have your own opinions on it as well if you saw it. I'm also a union delegate at work, as was just referenced, with the MEAA, which is the journalists' union. There's a couple of unions at the ABC. The MEAA tends to be the one that represents journalists like me, producers, the people who you see on the news, who are writing the news and working on the news, as opposed to the engineering folks and the sort of other side of the ABC. And I just wanted to say again how glad I am to be here today, and also just to emphasise that I'm speaking on my own behalf, and obviously I can't speak on behalf of the ABC. It's really nice to be in a room with friends of the ABC, because it's not always the case. I'm glad to see as well an interest in press freedom that extends beyond those like me who work in the media. At a time when faith in media and in journalists is quite low, and authoritarian instincts seem to find a pretty receptive audience, it's really important to do things like this. All of us, journalists anywhere, are working in a global context, and in that context I have to say it feels like one where press freedom is declining across the board. Many of us in different ways recently have been spending our time covering the Israel-Gaza war for several months now. Since this horrifying conflict began, the International Federation of Journalists says 109 journalists have been killed, 102 of them Palestinians. These have been the people who have been our window into Gaza. There's basically no other way to literally see what's happening there, other than those people who have been working there, many of whom have now been killed. And this is, we're talking about not just any story, but what's probably been the most important global story for the last several months. The Committee to Protect Journalists says this has been the deadliest period for journalists since they started collecting data in 1992. So while I'm happy to be here, it does feel like a bit of a grim moment to be reflecting on press freedom and on the safety of journalists especially. Those numbers put things in perspective for people like me, and they also send a clear message that the killing of journalists in conflict zones is not taboo. It's clearly wrong to believe, unfortunately, that we live in a world that universally acknowledges the right of people to be independently informed about what's happening in conflict zones and in many places beyond. I thought it might be worth noting here as well that the MEAA has actually this week condemned Israel's shuttering of the broadcaster Al Jazeera within Israel. The network was raided by Israeli police this week, with the BBC journalists who were trying to film that and report on it themselves barred from filming and reporting on it. I think this point also just briefly takes us to a case I'm sure many of you are following closely, which is the case of Julian Assange, who the MEAA has called on to be released. Let's not forget that he's in trouble in part for revealing the US killing of two Reuters journalists. I mean, one of the original acts, and one of the things obviously that struck me, maybe somewhat selfishly, about all of WikiLeaks was that horrible footage of those two Reuters journalists being gunned down in Iraq. You know, that's what I think about when I see him sort of in isolation and on the stand. In the offices where I work, Osmo, we thankfully don't face such severe threats as a result of our work. But threats do exist. A few weeks ago I got a message telling me the ABC South Asia correspondent was about to be kicked out of India. Avani Dias, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her reporting, she's an excellent reporter, had been the ABC's reporter there for some time. She'd been doing a fantastic job of bringing Australians a diverse set of stories from one of our biggest, most important and most complex partners. She's reported on international summits, on gendered violence, on cricket matches, and of course on the bridge too far for the Indian government. Avani filed a half-hour documentary for Foreign Correspondent in which she took a close look at the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian Sikh separatist who was murdered in Canada last year. As we speak, 3 men are facing trial for that alleged assassination, a murder the Canadian government suggests was committed at the behest of the Indian government. It's a massive, massive global story, and one with huge relevance for Australian audiences given our large Indian diaspora in particular. It's also an incredibly touchy subject for the Indian government. So as Avani was making this documentary with her team, they were questioned and intimidated by Indian intelligence officials as they were doing so. When the documentary was released, it was quickly banned on YouTube and on Twitter, now known as X, in India. So the Indian government basically had the documentary taken down within India. And the next thing you know, Avani was told her visa to stay in the country and cover its momentous upcoming national elections, which actually have already begun, would not be renewed. Her visa was effectively being cancelled. It was made clear to her that this was a result of her reporting. Indian officials said her reporting had, quote, crossed a line. That's pretty shocking for a number of reasons. Incidents like these don't just send a message to the ABC, but to all correspondents covering India. The message being that journalists who produce stories the government doesn't like will face punitive measures from the state. Something that has particularly troubled me is that India isn't a country I would usually have associated with that kind of heavy-handed behaviour, especially towards foreign journalists. The Australian and Indian governments see eye to eye on many key issues. They work together through the Quad Agreement with the US and Japan, which is a security arrangement. And as I said, we've seen, we have very, very close people-to-people ties. We're very close to India in many ways. We're not talking about Russia or China here, we're talking about the world's largest democracy. And it makes the public broadcaster's response to this incident all the more important, and it was pleasing, I have to say, to see the ABC did support their reporter here and backed Avani and took her safety and considerations very much into account. But again, this is now the benchmark that's being set, even by countries that proudly refer to themselves as democracies. It's a grim picture. There were efforts, by the way, to keep Avani in India, reporting on the Indian government and on the Indian elections. And the Indian government did finally back down after some behind-the-scenes pressure, I believe. But unfortunately that came too late, and as a result, Avani is now back and safely reporting in Australia, and you'll see her on Four Corners in the not-too-distant future, I believe. Closer to home, there's no shortage of barriers to the public interest reporting that all of us try and do at the ABC. Defamation law is something dealt with by basically every journalist every day. It's been interesting to see the high-profile cases of Ben Roberts-Smith and Bruce Lerman, both successfully defended by media companies on first hearing. But it's also been a reminder of how much money, willpower, and also just frankly good luck you need to have on your side to report those kind of stories and to follow them through and basically get away with them. Freedom of information requests, which are the dull but essential way into bureaucracies that want to keep us out, are painfully slow and often rendered completely ineffective. Last year I was reporting a story about a whistleblower at the oil and gas company Santos, who was working at one of their offshore sites in WA. These sites are a long way off the coast. They're literally out of sight, out of mind. There's not really any way into them other than the staff. I asked the state regulator or the state department I was dealing with for documents that the company had filed with them about an oil spill that had been seen by this whistleblower. But the department wouldn't hand those very important documents over because of an exemption in WA law blocking disclosures that could harm a company's reputation or market position. And it left me wondering, isn't that exactly the kind of documents the public should be seeing most urgently? It's just a good little example. I mean, any journalist you talk to who deals with FOI will tell you that while it can be quite a boring process, it's a really, really effective tool, one of the few tools we have to actually get inside bureaucracies and understand government decisions. And I think there's a broad feeling amongst journalists that it is being stymied increasingly into less and less effective, unfortunately. The story I was working on there was part of a series called Background Briefing, presented by Del Ferguson, looking at the fate of a number of Australians who'd seen something wrong and tried to say something about it. So my story, as I said, looked at a young man in WA who'd been shocked by the way Santos described this oil spill that had occurred. He accused the company of underplaying it and of covering up its true extent, allegations that the company was denying. This whistleblower had been inspired to blow the whistle to put this information into the public realm after seeing an image of 3 dead dolphins floating in the oil spill, which the company had publicly said had negligible environmental impact. The bar of leaking against your employer to doing something like what this young man did is very high in Australia, I'd say. You can lose your job, you could lose your friends, and you could very much end up in prison as well. But something I think is underappreciated is just how hard it is to blow the whistle even once you've decided you're brave enough to do it. This young man spent months trying to figure out how to do that without being identified and without breaking the law. In the end, he took images and testimony to the office of the Federal Senator David Pocock so that he could table them under parliamentary privilege. Now, it's a pretty long road to get to there. And before reporting this story, I would have assumed that was pretty much the gold standard when it comes to getting important documents and witness statements into the public realm without putting whistleblowers at legal risk. But it turns out that even if you find a Member of Parliament willing to do that for you, you're a long way from being out of the woods. Pocock's office essentially discovered that any slight mishandling of the situation could expose them and the whistleblower. And what's more, the government committee where Pocock was able to table documents and thus bring some legal protections to the whistleblower could have easily been blocked for political reasons. It didn't happen in this case, but this story, if it had been one that was more critical of the government, that was more harmful to the government's interests or to the opposition, it may well never have come out. Despite all that, something else really stands out about the whistleblower I profiled in my story, who was one of a series of whistleblowers that we were looking at in that series. And that's that he basically got away with it. He was able to do it, he wasn't identified, and he hasn't faced any charges or repercussions as a result of him blowing the whistle. With the thick digital trace that all of us now leave behind, and the surveillance powers of employers and of police, it's very difficult to do that, to see something wrong, talk about it publicly, and not be identified or face serious consequences. And even when you try and do the right thing, it's very easy to break the law along the way. A good example in my work life came early in my career. An outlet I was working for published a story revealing details of a secret scholarship given to Tony Abbott's daughter by a private college. It was quite a big story at the time. And we only found about it because of the whistleblowers who worked at the college. Now, one of those young whistleblowers provided documents and soon found herself on trial for a crime that is effectively referred to as unauthorised access to a computer database. Without the documents that she accessed, we couldn't have published the story, we wouldn't have known it was accurate, we wouldn't have had confidence to do that. But accessing them was technically a crime. It's not just blowing the whistle, speaking out publicly that's often criminalised. You'll probably be aware of some of the high-profile examples of that in the courts and whatnot now, but it's the actions you need to take leading up to that that can cause you just as much trouble and trip you up along the way. As part of the background briefing whistleblower series that I was working on, Adele Ferguson also outlined the way employers will try and attack whistleblowers before publication, as well as journalists. Ferguson had years earlier been publishing damning stories about the Commonwealth Bank that would eventually help spark a royal commission into the whole banking sector. What Ferguson recently revealed in this series is that at the time, a senior executive at the Commonwealth Bank called one of her bosses at Fairfax, where she was working then, warning them not to trust her reporting, and revealing in the call that they had somehow accessed private emails sent by Ferguson. Calls from the bank also noted the lucrative advertising that CBA bought with Fairfax. Thankfully, it takes more than that to scare Adele Ferguson, but it does underscore the lengths that powerful interests will go to block public interest reporting like hers. I don't know what the legal fix to these situations is, but clearly one thing that can turn the tide is public support and backing journalists and their sources. And again, that's why organisations like this, I think, are very, very important. Ultimately, the best weapon that we have is your support. I think that story also demonstrates pretty clearly the benefit of maintaining a strong, publicly funded national broadcaster. There's no shortage of brave reporters working for private companies, but the luxury for those of us at the ABC is that we'll never have one of those bosses take a call from a sponsor. It is, the ultimate benefit and luxury of working for a public broadcaster is that we work for the public. The independence of the ABC is jealously guarded by ABC staff. It is the most unifying value among all of us. And you see that any hint of interference leads to a very sharp reaction from the everyday ABC staff like me who work there. I remember being fairly new to the ABC in 2018 and seeing the hallways of Ultimo fill up as news spread that the ABC chair had advocated for a staff member, Emma Alberici, to be sacked to appease the federal government. It was an open and clear moment of attempted political interference, and people were furious about it. Staff literally walked out of the building in protest, and the chair soon resigned. It was a big, immediate and effective response from ABC staff. More recently, staff passed a no-confidence motion in the Managing Director David Anderson after the sacking of presenter Antoinette Lattouf in the face of persistent lobbying campaign against her. It's hard to know how these things are taken from the outside of the ABC, but to me they look like staff doing everything that we can to ensure the organisation is not unduly influenced. It's why we genuinely and deeply appreciate your support. We do everything that we can within the ABC to keep it strong and to keep it independent. But without adequate funding, without strong support for whistleblowers and our work, and without your support, we just won't succeed. We can't do it alone, and that's why, again, I'm very grateful to be here today, and I just want to conclude by saying thank you all for having me today.
We have a short opportunity to ask maximum questions.